Welcome to the last section of our HTML course. In this section, we're going to talk about forms and form elements. We're going to explore the inputs, buttons, labels, and other elements to create a form. In the next section, we will start our journey inside CSS. Let's start from this empty body tag. To create a form, we can use the form element. So just type form and press enter. You can see it automatically creates this action attribute for us. This action is the most important attribute for the form element. Remember we talked about client and server in the how the web works section? In that section, we talked about HTTP requests. These requests have methods. We can get data from the server. We can actually send data to the server. So if we get data from the server, that HTTP method would be get. And if we send data to the server, it can be a post, patch, delete, and we actually have other methods as well. So the action here can be post, patch, or other stuff where we want to send data to the server. But don't worry about that. We will talk about this topic inside JavaScript because with the JavaScript we can send HTTP requests. Alright, so we have this input element. You can see it added this type text for it. So this is the way it looks like on the web. You can see we can type anything. So we can change this type to number, and inside web you can see these buttons, and now if I try to type, nothing shows up because the type is number and I can only type numbers. Now let's change it to email. So we should type email. Notice that inside every form, if we press enter, it will reload the page. That is because of the submission. Let's change the email to password. So as we type, you can see the input is hidden. Let's change this password to checkbox. Now you can see we have this checkbox. The next one is radio. So I'm sure you've seen something like this inside the web. So let's just duplicate this. You can see now we have two radios. So we have other types of inputs like date, that we can select a date. And we also have file. If I click on that, I can select a file. Based on different types of input, we can add different types of other attributes. For example, we can limit the file type, or we can add a restriction to number of characters for the text type, and so on. For example, let's change this back to text, add another attribute called max length, and let's set it to 4. So you can see I cannot add more than 4 characters. These stuff are called validation. So we validate the input. We can add an attribute called required. So required will make it required when we submit the form. So if you press enter, you can see it asks us and says, please fill out this field. This is another validation attribute. We have another attribute called placeholder, which will show up whenever the input is empty. For example, I add here enter your name and you can see it's here. As soon as I start typing, it goes away. Beautiful. You can read about different attributes and different types for input inside a reference website. So don't worry if I quickly introduce them to you. You can refer back to the website if you want, or you can watch this video again and again. Alright, so another attribute is name. We can add a name to the input element, so whenever we submit the form, we know which value is related to which input. So let's create a first name and last name input. So here you can see we have two inputs for first name and last name. I'm gonna add a placeholder for each to distinguish them. Let's set this one to first name, and this bottom one to last name. Beautiful. So we have these two inputs. Let's remove the second input and focus on the first one. I'm gonna change the type for the first one to number, and I also change the placeholder to age. Change the name to age as well. So now we have this age. We can add a validation attribute for number inputs called min, and it will allow the minimum value for the input. For example, I try 12. Its value must be greater than or equal to 18. That's because of this minimum value here. So let's remove this, and now you can see I can select this age without any values. Notice when we select the value, the name of the input appears inside URL. This is because of the form submission process. It's not important right now, but just know that when you submit the form, it will be included with the URL encoded version. Let's remove all the elements and start with an empty form. I'm going to create this input with the type of email. So this is an email input. So if I try to submit this form, you can see it asks me for a valid email, which is true. Well, we have another element inside HTML called label. So label has this attribute called for, and then we can add an label in between the tags. So this way we make our inputs more descriptive and more accessible. So it's way more readable now than before. Alright, so let's investigate this for attribute. It's time to introduce you an important attribute for all HTML elements, and it's called ID. This ID is a unique value that we can add for each element. We can add every value that we want, and we will investigate this inside CSS. We use this ID attribute to select an element. So for example, now I add this ID of email, and then inside the for, I should add the ID of the element that this label is for. So let me just add email here. And now if I click on the label, you can see it focuses the email input because it correctly understands that this label is related to this input. So let's get back and create another input and another label for name. So I'm gonna add the ID of name and add it inside the for, and add it inside the for. And this way you can see if I click on the name, it focuses the input. Beautiful. So we can group them to solve that issue. So this way you can see with the div element we grouped them so each starts at its own line. So you can see this div creates a new line. So every time you create a div, it just takes the whole width, and everything that starts after goes to the next line. We have another grouping element called span. That span is like a div, but it won't take the whole width. So it's not important right now. We're going to explore that inside the CSS, where we talk about inline display and block display, but it's good to know about that right now. So if I change this to span, even though we have those container tags, those span tags, it is still messed up. So let's just get it back to the div element. This way, each group takes the whole width. Alright. So let's move on to the next element. Let's create another div tag, and let's create another label for message. So message. The next element is called text area. And text area is just like an input, but it has multiple rows. So let's add a name to that called message. An ID should be message because at the label we set the message. And this is how it looks like. You can see I can type in multi-lines. And unlike the input elements, we can have as much as lines as we want. So unlike an input element that is always in one line, text area has more lines. And in fact, there's an attribute called rows, where we can select the rows that we can see. So after that, we will have a scroll bar. The next element that we're going to talk about is select. So let's create another div element and write select and hit enter. So as always, it asks for a name and ID. So let's say country for the name, and the ID, let's say country again. Inside the select, unlike the other inputs, for select, we should pass an element called option, and we should provide a value and name for it. For example, here I say Netherlands as value and say again Netherlands for the label. Let's create another option, and I'm gonna select Control D or Command D on Mac, and I'm enabling the multi-cursoring, Iran, and another one for Canada. Beautiful. So this is how it looks like. You can see it's a select element. We can select. I'm sure you've seen something like this in the web before. So this is how you can create that. A select element and options. Let's add the label for it and call it country. Beautiful. So you can see this country now describes that label. This is a beautiful form that we have so far. Email, name, country, message, and it looks like a valid form. The last missing piece here is a button for submitting the form. So let's create that. So let's type button and say submit. So you can see we have just a simple button. And as you can see, when I click on that, we have the names here. So let's duplicate this button and create another button for reset. This button has an attribute called type, just like inputs. And we can set it to reset. So if we fill out the form and if we select the reset, you can see it clears the form. So this is the behavior of the reset button. These buttons have very broad usability inside web. It's not just about forms. We will explore them inside the JavaScript, but for now we use the button only for forms. Again, to read more and practice, you can refer back to the reference website and you can actually see them in action. So everything I tell you in this course is here as well. So now that this is the last section of our course, I've spent a lot of time creating this reference website just because I want to help you to learn better and make the course accessible for all the people. So the whole material for this course is free and published online. So I'm not going to charge you any time for anything I've teach you now or later. And I think it will help you learn better. And honestly, none of my courses are paid. All the things I teach you here or online is free and will be free forever. These stuff that I teach you is just a passion of mine, and I just try to help others as others helped me when I was getting started. So let's get back to our form. Let's explore more attributes. One of those attributes is disabled. If you put a disabled attribute on any input element or a button, it will be disabled. So there's no way to change the value. You can see it's not even selectable. So another attribute that we already talked about is required. So when we select the required, if we try to submit the form, it will ask us to fill out that input. So required is another attribute. Another one is read only. If something is read only, there's no way to change the value. And in fact, we can pass a value attribute to hard code the value for that input. For example, here, let's say test@gmail.com. You can see we can select that value or copy it, but there's no way to change this value because it's read only. And we can inspect the values inside DevTools. You can see we have all these divs, and inside each, we have the label and input. All right, so let's go back to the code. So I'm just gonna remove everything that we had so far, and I'm gonna add an empty checkbox. Just like this. So I'm gonna add an ID for this checkbox, and I'm gonna say receiving email. And I'm gonna add an ID with the for receiving email, and for a label, let's say, do you like to receive emails from us? And inside the web, you can see we have the text here. All right, so in the previous section, we built this menu. And in this section, we're going to add this form. So if you haven't watched the previous section, I highly recommend you doing so. We explored a lot of things, and right now we're going to extend that. So to create the form, we're going to add another section inside the main element for form. And if you remember, if you click on the welcome, it will disable the CSS and styling, and we can see the pure structure of the HTML. So we're going to create basically this section. This is the form, and the rest is just styling and CSS, and we will explore that later. Let's just focus on this form and try to add all the form elements inside this HTML. So inside the VS Code, I create a form like this and ignore the action completely for now. and we're just going to add the form elements. So the first element is the inside here. You can see we have this title. So let's just copy this title, and then we have this name input. So this title actually is not a title, it's a legend inside a form. So this is a new tag that it's worth learning. It says legend represents a caption for the rest of the content of the legend element's parent. So basically, right now that we have form, legend is a child and it will describe the form. So I'm just gonna write your information. Then we have a label for the name, and I'm gonna write name for the label. And also it's optional. And also we have an input. So the type is text. We just have to add the ID of name because of the label. Also it has this placeholder called your name. Let's go ahead and add the placeholder your name. Beautiful. Let me just zoom in. Now we have this first input. Next, let's go ahead and create this email field. It is basically the same. We have a label for email and email, optional. Then we have the input for email, and I'm gonna write the ID email. For placeholder, let's go ahead and add you@example.com. So you@example.com. Beautiful. And also not forget to add the ID of email, because we have a label for it, email field here. Next, we have this simple input here that asks what is your favorite item on the menu. So it's basically the same as above. We have a label for that, and then we're going to create the input for it. Label is going to be for favorite, and I'm going to create the input, the type of text, and ID should be favorite. Also, we're going to add this required attribute, because whenever we submit the form, as you can see, it asks for a value for that field. Next, we have the selection about the menu rating. So first we're going to create a label for that as always, and I'm going to call it rating, and I'm going to paste the label here. Then I'm going to create the select, and for the name I'm going to say rating. ID should be rating as well. For select, I'm going to add an option for excellent. So here you can see we have excellent, good. So excellent. And rest of the options. All right, so here's the form so far. We have the select, the email, and we have all these elements here. Beautiful. And you might notice this first option here is disabled, and it's like a title. We can create an option for that and make it, and I'll write for it, choose an option, and for the value leave it empty and make it disabled. So this way, if you first visit the page, you can see we have that option in there. Also, we're going to add a new attribute called selected to make this disabled option selected for the first time. It's like a placeholder there. So it asks first for that, and then whenever you change that, it won't show up again. And at the bottom of the form, we have this text area here. So after the select, simply I'm going to create a label for message, and I'm going to add message for label. And then there's this text area. For name, I'm going to say message. ID should be message as well. And let's add this attribute for, I'm going to paste this message label. And for the attributes of the text area, I'm going to say rows 4 to make it 4 rows, just like what we have here. And there we go. We have this text area here as well. It has 4 lines and it's also adjustable. And the very last thing here is that button to submit the form. Submit feedback. Let me just turn this to uppercase. Okay. And add a type of submit. So whenever we click on that button, it will submit the form. So here's the HTML for the website, and here is our HTML. So you can see both are the same. So we've done a great job here in HTML. And actually, I forgot to add a placeholder for this text area. It says your feedback, and with this, it should be exactly the same. Beautiful. So the last topic that we're going to talk about is these links, that whenever we click on them, it jumps to a section. This will happen if you add an ID to a section. For example, here you can see this has ID of drinks, and you can see on the URL we have hashtag drinks. So all we have to do is just add ID to each section and then reference them inside the anchor tag. So let's get out of this form and get to the top of the main section. Let's collapse it and collapse the footer. We have header, main, and footer. So inside the header, I'm gonna press shift and then click on this to collapse all the child elements, and then go inside the nav and then open this UL. Here we have these links. So for example, for the href, let's go inside the main and add an ID to the first section. For example, in this section, I'm going to add an ID of today, and then inside, I'm going to add this. Then in the next section, we're going to add the ID as breakfast. And then for a link, I'm going to add hashtag breakfast. And I'm going to repeat this for other sections as well. Here I have lunch. Add an ID of lunch, and then add href to hashtag lunch. So inside our web page, if I click on this first item, you can see it just jumps to that section. Beautiful. Click on the lunch, it jumps to the lunch. So this was our project. Hopefully it was helpful. And actually with this, we wrap up our HTML course. You can check out our YouTube channel. You can comment if you want to ask any questions. You can see the reference website. Check it out anytime you want. And if you want to follow along again, you can check out the next module about the CSS. So hopefully see you in the CSS.